Good morning, everyone. Good to have you here. Morning to folks on the live stream. We see you, or you see us. And glad you're here. This is our fourth of four. This is our final session in this summer series on Between the Testaments. Thanks for those of you who have been coming regularly or semi-regularly. Thanks to those who are here for the first time. Plenty of stuff to learn. Today's theme is a little bleak. Because the material that we're looking at is material that's often really angry in terms of its tone. It's often violent in terms of its tone. It comes out of contexts of deep suffering and frustration. And so I don't really have a whole lot of wisdom right now to talk about what that means, talking about this today, given the events of yesterday. I'll just maybe say this. When it comes to questions of violence, religion has always been a means by which people have tried to interpret the violence in their world, the injustice in their world, sometimes the randomness of suffering and violence in their world. People have turned to religion to help them understand that. I suppose things are true with in matters of like law and politics and journalism, right? We've got different kind of places in our corporate life where we look to find answers. At times, religion has contributed to violence. We should name that. That's probably true with all religions as well as all political systems and even sometimes, other, kind of civic institutions. At its best, religion has helped humanity alleviate suffering and to work its way through suffering and to seek peace. That's one of the reasons I'm here on a Sunday morning as opposed to, out somewhere else. There's a theologian I like who talks about how the test of a religious worldview often comes down to two different things. And one is, how do your religious ideas help you cope with, not necessarily explain, but just cope with tragedy and suffering? And the second one, how does your religious system help you deal with the other, people who are different from you, people who disagree with you, people who are out to get you, whatever, however you want to define the other. And so again, at its best, religion, I think, helps us in those places, whether your religion is Christianity or anything else. And a lot of this comes down to the person of Jesus, for me at least. And we're going to see writings that were written before the time of Jesus, but also writings, I think, influence the world in which Jesus lives. So if today seems especially violent, political, it is. That wasn't by design on today, but just I think there's a way in which that might help us think through my complex feelings today, at least, if I can use all of you as my therapist for this morning. So that's not too vague, but there's something about reading texts about violence that makes us think, this could have been written yesterday, right? Or this sounds like things I read online all of the time. And that's one of the problems, perhaps. So again, each week, you've seen this slide if you've been coming before, we're going to look at a group of ancient texts or a type of ancient writings. And I also want to consider a topic about the Bible and the societies that it came from. So we've talked about text, but we've also tried to talk a bit about history or contexts, right? Where some of these writings have come from, why they matter, and kind of how does knowing the history behind the writings help us get a better grip on what they say and why they say it. So also each week I put up this slide as a reminder that Second Temple Judaism, and I'll redefine that for us in a minute, was not the same thing as ancient Israelite religion. In other words, what we read about what's going on during the time of King David, for example, or some of the images of what priests were supposed to do in the book of Leviticus, those things are being interpreted differently and in many ways lived out differently when we get to the time of Jesus. There's about a 1,000-year gap between David and Jesus, for example. And that makes sense, right? Religions evolve, religions change because culture changes, because philosophy changes and language changes and societies changes and politics change. Hopefully we learn from our mistakes and build on our successes. So there were changes, or at least differences in the air, in the Judaism in which Jesus lives and breathes, the Judaism in which Paul lives and breathes, compared to their ancestors from many, many centuries prior. And as well, this Second Temple Judaism was diverse. And just to illustrate that, remember last year, if you participated in any of these, we looked at the Older Testament. And at times Margaret and I talked about the ways in which the message of the books of Samuel and Kings, for example, these are books that are describing the nation of Israel and later the nation of Israel and Judah as they, for a few brief moments, thrived, but then eventually fell into calamity and eventually were wiped out by foreign invaders, and exiles ensued after that. But a lot of the message of books like Samuel and Kings was, this is happening because you blew it. Right? This is happening because you messed up. You turned from the Lord your God, therefore here come the Babylonians. That's a lot of the theology of those books seems to express that. And we tried to talk about how disturbing that is, kind of a blame the victim type of theology. And does that work for us or not? And some of the prophets also seem to say similar things, but some of the prophets also help reinterpret that. And we saw in the Older Testament ways in which there are different voices, different kinds of competing perspectives on why is all of this horrible stuff happening to us and where is God in the midst of it. As we went on last year, I think it was in January where we looked at the book of Daniel. Sometime in the spring, we looked at the book of Daniel. And I noted that when we get to the book of Daniel, the message is even different as well. In the book of Daniel, there's all sorts of suffering taking place amongst Jews. And the message there appears to be the reason you're suffering is because you're living faithfully, which is a really different perspective, isn't it, than the other one? The reason you're suffering is because it's your fault. You didn't live the way you were supposed to live. In Daniel, there are monsters out there. There are horrible political realities out there. There are evil people out there. There are other evil forces in the world, and your suffering is because it's a testimony to your own faithfulness. Therefore, hang in there, hang in there, hang in there. That's the 5-cent version of the theology of parts of the book of Daniel. So, and when I talked about Daniel, I pointed out the first half of that book is composed largely of court stories, courtroom stories in the court of a king. And it's a lot of satire because the king is just unbelievably stupid and the faithful people are unbelievably faithful. And there are these really stark contrasts. But the second half of the book of Daniel is a really different type of writing. It's full of visions that Daniel has, visions that are full of symbolism about destruction and about God eventually setting things right, about God eventually bringing peace and plenty and righteousness when it's all about war and deprivation and evil. And today we're going to look at more of that kind of literature, like the second half of the book of Daniel. And so just to place us then where we are, if some of you have been coming before and have seen this might be the timeline's last appearance. I'm sorry to say. Maybe I'll use it somewhere else. But anyway, a timeline I kind of created, we've had Saul, David, and Solomon way over there on the left-hand side. After Solomon, the kingdom of Israel splits into a northern kingdom called Israel, a southern kingdom called Judah. Israel doesn't last that long in the grand scheme of things, about 200 years before it's wiped out by the Assyrians. For the most part, the residents there are scattered, and lost is not quite the right word, but kind of integrated into other societies. Judah persists for a lot longer. Again, this timeline's not to scale. But then Judah falls there at the very bottom to the Babylonian Empire in 586. And then you've got this period of exile that's there in the pink, where the elites from Judah, educated people, priests, anybody who's literate, anybody who might be seen as an influencer, that word means something different now. I realize there was no Instagram back then, but influencers are in Judah, and after the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, Cyrus the Great of Persia allows them to return to their land, and that's where, or at least that's roughly the general period where a lot of the Older Testament writings are being collected, or being edited, or being written down, and are being saved and are being cherished. And so in other words, a lot of the Older Testament comes out of this experience of what just happened to us. How did our once great nation fall? How did the temple get destroyed? What does it mean that we're back in the land now? And how should we therefore live? Remember some of that? A couple nods. Okay, a couple nods are good. Good to see. And then what happens after that, the green line here, is what scholars typically refer to as Second Temple Judaism. In other words, the temple is rebuilt, and Judaism, again, starts to become more diverse, more spread out, and also in many ways lives under the dominance of other kinds of other political figures, other political realities. And so just to give you a sense of what that looks like, and we've talked a little bit about some of these things in the last 3 weeks. Here's some of the imperial dominance, at least over Jews who live in the place that we call Israel or Palestine today. Alexander the Great comes to that region in 332 BCE, before the Common Era, and now they are ruled by what you might call the Hellenistic Empire, which eventually starts in Macedonia, just north of the northern part of today's Greece. And so Jews are ruled by the Macedonians for about 30 years. After Alexander's death, there's some infighting for a while, and eventually a group of Greek-speaking bureaucrats, I guess, or political leaders from Egypt, called the Ptolemies, have control over Israel. In the year 200 to 141, the Seleucids, who are based in Syria, and we talked last week about the Maccabean Revolt, 2 weeks ago, about the Maccabean Revolt, a significant war that has its flare-ups from time to time, but roughly lasts for over 25 years. That is a war between Jews in Judea and the surrounding area and the Syrians, the Seleucids. It's also very much a civil war among Jews themselves in that area. Big debates about what's the right way forward. How isolated, how distinctive should Israel be? Should we be allowing all of this Greek cultural influence to remain, or should we not? Should we throw off the yoke of the oppressor when we've got so many economic and social intertwining, interests that are there? It's not entirely a civil war between what you might call liberals or conservatives, although those terms don't mean much, I don't think, anywhere anymore. Nor is it a battle between non-elites and elites, but it's very much a battle or a war that's bound up in questions of what Jewish identity is supposed to look like in a changing world. After the Seleucids are finally overthrown in 141 to 63, I talked about the Hasmoneans. All the weeks blur together for me today. In recent weeks, I've talked about the Hasmoneans, right, who are a line of Jewish kings, Jewish royal families, who rule over the area for about 80 years and are notoriously corrupt. Shocker, right? Notoriously corrupt, a lot of infighting. There's a way in which the royal, the royal interests, the political interests are deeply bound up in the temple, and so kings and high priests are connected, or their families are intermarried. And this is 2 weeks ago, and I talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But anyway, the Hasmoneans rule. And for some, if you're an elite living around Jerusalem and connected to these families, life's pretty good. A lot of other Jews are deeply upset at the Hasmoneans, right, and feel like Jewish identity is continuing to devolve. So even though they're quote-unquote self-ruled, the Jews in the land are self-governed during the Hasmoneans, it's still a very tumultuous time. And the Hasmonean period effectively comes to an end in 63 when the Romans come and take Jerusalem and rule over Jerusalem for several centuries, including the time when Jesus is born. And during the time of the Romans, you've also got client kings. You've got Jewish kings who continue to rule, who continue to use that name king, but they're essentially Roman puppets. So Herod the Great, you might be familiar with that name when the time Jesus is born. Herod's the one who, in Matthew's gospel, orders the murder of infants in and around Bethlehem. He comes across in Matthew as, I use this word in a non-technical way, kind of a paranoid, just kind of crazed ruler, and that's what other sources tell us he essentially was. One of his sons, named Herod Antipas, is referred to in the Gospels. He's the Herod who's ruling in Galilee when Jesus is alive. But he's also subordinate to the Roman governors during that time. Does that make sense? So even though there is some Jewish self-rule, or what looks like self-rule, these are all people who are put in place by the Romans, and the Romans will dismiss them at any time if they want to. So my point here simply is to walk through. We've got, 300 plus years BCE, plus during the time of Jesus, even afterward, right, well into 3rd, 4th century, where the Romans are ruling this era. And what comes with that is obviously some violence. What comes with that is a sense of cultural humiliation, right, of being ruled by outsiders. But you've also got this infighting, this sometimes lively debate about what does it mean to be Jewish in an ever-changing world, which is why Jesus in many ways is engaged by so many people who have questions for him, right? What do you think about the law when it says this? What do you think about the law when it says that? There are many ways in which people tried to make sense of this period of time. And one of the things that happens during this period, during the 3rd century, so roughly during the time of the Ptolemies and moving into the time of the Seleucids, what appears to be a new kind of Jewish literature starts to emerge in that period. And this is literature that scholars often refer to as apocalyptic literature, and I'll explain that term in just a minute. And this new kind of literature emerges. It's not the only kind of literature that Jews are producing. It's just one kind. So when I look at the stuff today, don't think this is the only way Jews talked about the world or talked about God. But this new kind of literature emerges that tries to make sense of all of the turmoil, all of the chaos, and just kind of generation after generation of frustration for a lot of Jews during that time. Also, none of these apocalyptic writings that I'm going to talk about ever were part of anybody's scriptures, as far as we can tell, with the exception of the second half of the book of Daniel, which is still there in Jewish scripture and in Christian scripture. And of course, the most famous piece of literature like this is the Christian book of Revelation, right? The last book in the Newer Testament. We'll talk about that one like in March or April next year. It'll be a great way to celebrate Easter together. So, right, it's a fascinating book for a number of reasons, and also maybe the most misread or misused book. So just to note that none of the literature I'm going to talk about today ever appears to have kind of risen up to that level of scripture, but it does reflect the ways in which some Jews were talking about the world and talking about God. One interesting thing to note is that the book of Jude, which is in the Newer Testament, you're probably like, never heard that one from the pulpit. It's a tiny book. It's only, like 25 verses or so. In the Newer Testament, it actually quotes from one of these apocalyptic writings, which is kind of fascinating, a book called First Enoch, which we're not going to get too deeply into today. So one more bit of evidence, right, that this literature is circulating, that people are reading it, and it's influencing the way they think about God and the world. All right, that's the history part. That's like setting the stage of kind of the mood and some of the suffering that's taking place. If I lost anybody confused? Want your money back? All right, good. So what happens in this new literature emerges in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And it's literature that I said is often called apocalyptic. And some of the writings are in fact self-named as an apocalypse. In fact, in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, the first word in that book is actually apocalypse. It's a Greek word that I'll talk about in just a minute. It's hard to talk about these apocalypses in America because that word apocalypse itself has undergone quite a bit of change, right? When you hear the word apocalypse, you probably think of some kind of hellscape. You probably think of just kind of unknown misery, right? We're talking about a climate apocalypse in some settings, right? What happens when the world becomes unlivable? Some of this we can thank Francis Ford Coppola. Remember the movie Apocalypse Now from, I think it was 1979, a movie about the Vietnam War, which everybody in this movie is morally deranged, it appears, right? One of the themes of the film is just what war does to people, or what war manifests itself out of. We've also grew up in a time and still live in an era where we talk about things like nuclear apocalypse, right? And that usually has kind of an end of the world, utter destruction kind of feel to it. This isn't necessarily what these apocalypses, these ancient apocalypses that I'm going to talk about, are focused on. It is, they're not necessarily about destruction and about just leveling everything. The word has kind of changed, at least how Americans use it typically. What I mean by apocalypse is something more like this, something more about looking behind a curtain, right? Not necessarily about war and destruction, but getting able to peek behind the curtain and to see the inner workings of something, right? To be able to look and see what other people cannot see. And that's where the word comes from. The Greek word that's behind all of this is literally apokalypsis, which means to remove the cover from something. It's an unveiling, an uncovering, or literally a revelation, right? And so what makes these books called apocalypses is because they purport to describe something or some things or realities that ordinary people can't see. in their ordinary lives, right? They purport to be divine revelation that's passed down. Does that make sense? If you've read the book of Revelation at the end of the Newer Testament, you might know that, right? I'll talk about this in a minute, but it purports to tell what the author, a man named John, was allowed to see when John was taken up into the heavens and allowed to witness God on the throne and allowed to witness angels and all sorts of things going on, the inner workings of stuff, right? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, that kind of a thing, right? What happens when somebody can see what's really going on? Makes sense in terms of where the name comes from, where apocalypse comes from. So what happens in this literature? I'm going to show you some in a minute, but just what should we look for? What makes this kind of literature similar? And here's a number of points. One is they tend to express convictions about both the reality of present crises. They acknowledge that life is hard, that things are awful, but they also cling to this future hope. In other words, they keep present and future in a kind of dynamic conversation. And for the most part, they don't let go of future hope, right? God will eventually prove to be faithful. Just hang on a little bit longer seems to be one of the main messages of these books. They purport to describe revelations given by God, often full of mystery and symbolism. Monsters, these kinds of like connections of things, dragons with wings and, birds that have snake bodies or things like that. They're this kind of, they try to describe the monstrosities of the evil things in the world while at the same time connecting them to knowable things, right? And so you get these weird these creatures that are in some of them. Symbolism, numbers are really important. Some of them purport to describe like the inner workings or the inner logic of the universe. Often they are narrated by a seer, right? Somebody who's given a vision, who's granted access to divine communication or is given a tour of the heavenly places. Someone's been whisked up into heaven and been given a tour and told, write everything down and go tell everybody. And then that's what takes place. Sometimes there's an angelic figure who's present, like a tour guide, who helps interpret everything that the seer is being told. So this kind of adds credibility to the writing, so to speak, right? I saw all of this weird stuff, but then the angel said to me, write this down. This is what it means. And attention is often given to the causes of oppression and suffering. And the causes are sometimes described as spiritual. And so other heavenly figures play a role in this. Some of them talk about a devil or Satan. Some of them talk about just evil superhuman figures, right? These other anti-God forces in the universe who play a part in contributing to human misery and the oppression of innocent people. And so the perspectives of these writings often imagine an intersection between what we might call human politics, right? Who's in charge? How do they get in charge? What are their policies? What are they doing? But also this spiritual conflict in heavenly places. In other words, one of the convictions of a lot of these writings is that nothing in the world is random. Nothing in the world is simply happening by chance. Everything that happens here is somehow coordinated to or maps onto a spiritual battle that's taking place between whether it's angels and devils or between God and Satan or just the things that make the world go. Most people in the ancient world believe this. You read ancient Greeks who are writing history at this period, people who are not Jews or Christians. There were no Christians in the 3rd century BCE, but people who are not Jewish. And these historians all believe that there are some kinds of, whether we want to call it fate or something else, there are forces that are driving human history. Nothing is just left up to humanity by itself. And in these apocalypses, right, those forces tend to be one side good, belonging to God, one side evil, not belonging to God. It's a rather simplistic moral view, but one that has a lot of rhetorical power. These apocalypses, they issue promises of divine deliverance coming from beyond. The assumption seems to be that only God can fix this mess. In other words, the way out is not going to be that all of a sudden we're going to get it right. What's going to be the way forward is God's going to finally break in and set things right. Right? God's going to transform the world. And a few, not all, and not even most of these apocalypses speak about a coming deliverer they refer to as the Anointed One, which is what the word Messiah means. Right? Messiah in Hebrew, Mashiach, means the Anointed One. So these contribute in some ways to expectations. How is God going to set the world right? God's going to send a deliverer. God's going to send somebody who's going to be the agent of that transformation. Frequently, the apocalypses express expectations about a coming end to history, or at least the culmination of history's current age. They often talk about things about to happen, right? The world is going to be utterly transformed. When I say an end to history, I don't necessarily mean destruction, but kind of a new world will emerge out of the old one. There's that kind of an imagination of rebirth. Resurrection of the dead, right? There's more to life than just here and now is a theme that gets a lot of attention, right? There will be a judgment. There will be an afterlife for people. References to paradise. Sometimes these authors claim that they've been granted a vision of what paradise will look like as well. I bring that up because there's not a lot of attention to resurrection or paradise in the Older Testament. These are things that obviously get quite a bit of attention in the Newer Testament. And last thing on these slides, the authorship of these writings is usually attributed to a famous figure from the past. I mentioned earlier a book called First Enoch. If you know who Enoch was, Enoch's a kind of a shadowy figure, not shadowy in the sense of untrustworthy, but doesn't show up much in the book of Genesis, who we're told walks with God and then was no more because God took him. And that's always traditionally been interpreted that Enoch was so righteous that Enoch didn't die and God just translated Enoch to heaven one day. And so somebody wrote an apocalypse using the name of Enoch, claiming to be Enoch. There's an apocalypse, there's several attributed to Baruch, who was the scribe for Jeremiah. There's one attributed to Abraham. There's one attributed to Ezra, who was also a scribe in Israel's history. There's some that are ascribed to Solomon as well. So, in other words, people are writing in the name of past revered figures, almost as if to say, what if Enoch were here today? What would he think about the world, right? It's when people say things like, what if George Washington were born today? What would he think about America? Or what if the Apostle Paul came to Westminster Presbyterian Church? What would he say? You know, I mean, it's a rhetorical device. It's a way of saying, what if the wisdom of the past now suddenly was here to visit us in our present tense? That's what these writings look like. And just to give you a brief example, here's one from maybe the most famous apocalypse, which is actually a Christian document. Of course, this is written probably at the end of the first century of the Common Era, around probably in the early 90s. This is how the book of Revelation, not quite how it begins, but in the opening chapter, I, John, your brother, who share with you the persecution and the kingdom and the endurance in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. What in the world does that sound like, right? Something unmistakable. Saying, write in a book that what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamum. I'm not going to read all this. And then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands. Ooh, 7, that's got to mean something. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. So hear the symbolism in all of this. If you take it literally, it's going to get really weird really quickly. I mean, just almost unimaginable. But it's also poetry, and it's also symbolism. In his right hand, he held 7 stars. And from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining with full force. So, I mean, this majestic image, right? We call it an appearance of Jesus to him, who doesn't look like your ordinary human being. So notice John says, I saw this. I was instructed to write this down. He speaks in ways that use a lot of familiar imagery, but in some unfamiliar ways, right? We're not used to seeing a sword coming out of somebody's mouth, for example. Later on in Revelation chapter 4, after this I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open, right? A revelation, right? And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne, and one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian, and around the throne there is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. Seeing a vision of a heavenly throne room, right, with these other figures there as well. This is kind of classic apocalypse, right? We see this in some other Jewish writings. So just to say, right, it's relatively unfamiliar to a lot of us because we haven't read many of these. But if you've ever poked around in the book of Revelation, you already are seeing some similar themes. I'm going to pause here briefly because we're at the halfway point. Any questions so far? I feel like we've done kind of a big dump of like history and misery and text without a lot of text. But Rocky's going to get his steps in today. Bring the microphone up to the front. Phil Donahue had a longer microphone, I think, that would reach. Remember those days?
You described the intersection of heavenly conflict and the politics of this world.
Yeah.
Intersection. Was causation assumed, or was causation assumed?
Yeah, I mean, the cause of what's going on here, are these superhuman realities. That's what's causing all of the trouble. So, like one of Daniel's visions is about these different beasts that come out of the water, come out of the sea. And they appear to be, each of these beasts appears to be symbolic of some of those different empires that I talked about earlier. And so that's kind of the thing, like, who are these empires? How do you even describe what it looks like when you look at the horizon and this invading army is coming in from a place you've never heard of called Nineveh or something like that? That experience is kind of chalked up to this grotesque kind of spiritual power that exists out there. Do you see what I mean? It's almost this kind of, how do you describe that in terms that, because the simple terms of how many horsemen or how many shields and how many spears doesn't quite add up. Does that make sense? That it's just kind of a way of describing these empires as utterly out of our control, in some ways larger than life, or larger than the sum of their parts.
If you were today and somebody was on a street corner stating all this, you'd probably think he was higher than a kite.
Probably, yeah.
And that maybe he needed to be locked up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little, it's very hard to understand this religiously compared to the rest of the books of the New Testament or of the Old Testament. When someone is speaking like this, when you met people that talk like this, and you think they're loony.
Yeah. Yes. It's and so somebody's going to ask me, where do these come from? Like, are these, and we don't know. We don't have enough other literature from the period to kind of try to make a bigger map of how people are thinking. Some have proposed these might have come out of a strand of Jewish mysticism, right? Most religions have mystics of some kind, people who claim to be able to commune with God in some way, or that distinction between humanity and divinity gets blurred. Sometimes people who have visions, who have kind of mantic experiences. So I mean, it could have come out of that kind of way of being Jewish. I don't know, I've not studied the sociology of that enough, but if you're part of a group where everybody's having visions, you're probably more likely to start having visions yourself, is my guess. One question we probably can't answer is, did everybody believe this or not? Or did everybody say this is symbolic, this is like what a sermon might sound like, or not? Others have proposed that these might have come out of the influence of some other cultures as well, that other surrounding cultures had their own mystic traditions or their own visionary kind of religious systems, and so that also could have kind of contributed to this. I'm not saying that every Jew everywhere was writing an apocalypse, but there were some of these that were written down, and they were interesting enough or weird enough that people copied them, translated them into different languages, so we know that they circulated. It's not like we just found one of these, but we found multiple. But they do I like my religion a little bit rational. I like mystery, but I'm on more that side of the continuum personally. And this definitely swings toward the other side of the pendulum here, towards something a little more. I'm trying to speak as respectfully as I can, kind of out there, kind of different. That's a nice Minnesota word. That's different. Yeah. We'll point out too that this does not become the dominant form of writing or thinking in Judaism or Christianity. In fact, Judaism in the 2nd century after Jesus pretty much rejects these texts entirely, sees them as a little bit dangerous in some ways as well. And in Christianity, I mean, if you want to talk the last 2,000 years of Christian history, people like this pop up from time to time who say the world's going to end. I know the date. They usually say, give me your money as well. These kind of movements pop up. I believe they pop up in other religions from time to time as well, kind of, whether it's a doomsday scenario or whether it's just, I know something you don't. And we have to be really, really careful when people say that, obviously. Yeah,
How do
Sarah.
the apocalyptic writings get categorized in prophetic writings? Are they a kind of prophetic writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're similar in some ways, but the prophets of the Older Testament, they claim to speak for God for the most part, but they don't usually claim to have had like a tour of heaven. And their symbolism is usually less kind of esoteric and less complicated. But there's a possible connection there to some of those prophetic writings. It's kind of like the prophets on steroids in some ways. It's just a lot more intensified and a lot more kind of deliberately obscure than the prophets were. Yeah, Mustafa.
Yes, I would suggest that an introduction to the study of the book of Apocalypse or Revelation is the allegory of the cavern of Plato to introduce the congregation to the model of reality and the realm of idea according to Plotinus.
Yeah, so this takes me back to my undergraduate philosophy days. So Plato has this allegory of a cave, which some of you might have been familiar with. I won't go too deeply into that, but that gets reinterpreted by other philosophers, like you mentioned, Plotinus. So there's plenty of other people outside of the Jewish world in this period who are contemplating the nature of reality and how much can humanity know, and how much are we influenced by what we see, and how much are we unable to see because of where we are. And so there is a sense in which these apocalypses are kind of this move to a better vantage point, right, where you can see above the fog. So that's part of it as well, right? And that's going on in a variety of religions and philosophical movements at the time. So here the thing is, like, how do you know you can trust somebody? And if the author is saying, well, I saw a vision of heaven, that's a pretty good perspective. It's a pretty good reality point to view from. So, yeah, so as weird as these sound, there are other people who are talking about all sorts of ways of understanding the limits of what it means to be human and trying to make sense of the trials of what it means to be human as well. Some of these apocalypses are clearly anti-Seleucid. They clearly seem to be like responding to some of the political misfortunes or the political violence that people are experiencing under the Seleucids. I want to point out again, just one more time, this is not the only kind of Jewish literature being produced during this period, right? This is a subset of it. But it's a subset that was kept by some people, and in some ways, Christians have been really interested in it because of the way in which it talks about kind of an expectation of God breaking in, which is a good way to describe what Jesus is in its own way. A little less violent, perhaps. What do some of these say? I just want to introduce you to a couple of them. So one called the Psalm of Solomon. This has been dated the early 1st century BCE, so probably within 50 years before the birth of Jesus. Sorry if the print is small. I know the print is, sorry because the print is small here. I'll just read it to you out loud as well. See, Lord, and raise up for them your king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel in the time known to you, O God. Here's a hope, right? Bring back David, right? Or bring back a David, a son of David, somebody in David's lineage. Undergird him with the strength to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction, in wisdom and in righteousness to drive out the sinners from the inheritance, to smash the arrogance of sinners like a potter's jar, to shatter all their substance with an iron rod, to destroy the unlawful nations with the word of his mouth. At the warning of the nations, he will flee from his presence, and he will condemn sinners by the thoughts of their hearts. He will gather a holy people whom he will lead in righteousness, and he will judge the tribes of the people that have been made holy by the Lord their God. Not hard to figure out what's going on here, right? Get rid of those people, bring back the righteous ones. And he will purge Jerusalem and make it holy as it was even from the beginning, for nations to come from the ends of the earth to see his glory. You might hear echoes of the last part of the book of Isaiah in that, right? That Jerusalem would become now almost a magnet for the nations who want to know God. To bring gifts, her children who had been driven, to bring as gifts her children who had been driven out, and to see the glory of the Lord with which God has glorified her. And he, this deliverer, will be a righteous king over them, taught by God. There will be no unrighteousness among them in his days, for all shall be holy, and the king shall be the Lord Messiah. For he will not rely on a horse and rider and bow, nor will he collect gold and silver for war, nor will he build up hope in a multitude for a day of war. So it's interesting, there's all this talk about deliverance and destruction, right, and driving people out, what looks like a military victory. But then you also have things like he's not going to have a horse or a rider and bow. He's not going to use conventional weaponry. Nor will he collect gold and silver for. He's not going to tax you like other kings did, like David did. Nor will he build up hope in a multitude for a day of war. In other words, it's deliverance, and it looks violent, but it's also not violent, or it's not conventionally violent, right? They're kind of dealing with these various themes here. Another apocalypse, 4th Ezra. I remember I mentioned Ezra was one of the scribes in the Old Testament after the return from exile. Again, these are parts of much larger books. I just pulled out some, especially juicy parts. For behold, the time will come when the signs which I have foretold to you will come to pass. Again, Ezra is recounting these predictions. The city which now is not seen shall appear, and the land which now is hidden shall be disclosed. And everyone who has been delivered from the evils that I have foretold shall see my wonders. For my son, the Messiah, shall be revealed, and those who are with him, and those who remain shall rejoice 400 years. And after these years, my son, the Messiah, shall die, and all who draw human breath. And the world shall be turned back to primeval silence for 7 days, as it was at the first beginning, so that no one shall be left. And after 7 days, the world which is not yet awake shall be roused, and that which is corruptible shall perish. So interesting, the vision here is that this Lord Messiah will come, and somehow the earth will be almost reset, right? It'll return back to this primeval silence for 7 days, and then this new era of human history will start again. So the imagination here, in 4th Ezra at least, is less about destruction and warfare and more about a kind of new creation, right? About a kind of a way of bringing the current world to an end and starting a new one. Again, these books don't appear to be revered as scripture by anybody, but they reveal to us ways in which some Jews were trying to make sense of the calamity in this world, but also, what is God going to do to fix it? Psalms of Solomon says God's going to send somebody who's going to clean house. 4th Ezra says God's going to have to remake this world because it's so messed up. So again, you see this yearning for newness in a lot of these texts. Apocalypse of Baruch. Baruch was Jeremiah's scribe. This is a little more violent. The last ruler who is left alive at that time will be bound, whereas the entire host will be destroyed. He's describing the end of a battle, kind of this cosmic battle. And they will carry him on Mount Zion. This is this last ruler, almost a satanic figure or some kind of like an emperor. And they will carry him on Mount Zion, and my anointed one will convict him of all his wicked deeds and will assemble and set before him all the works of his hosts. And after these things he will kill him and protect the rest of my people who will be found in the place that I have chosen. And his dominion will last forever until the world of corruption has ended and until the times which have been mentioned before have been fulfilled. So again, is it too much to call it a revenge fantasy of some kind, right? This belief that what God is going to have to do is destroy the people who are responsible for these things. I mentioned at the very beginning today, there's an anger that courses through some of these writings, or at least a deep frustration with the way things are. And sometimes what they imagine is newness in all of its glory, but sometimes the path to getting there is often a rather violent path in these texts. This is too long. I'll go to the very bottom, right? This idea of this is again, the anointed one is basically he's going to kill everybody. He's going to kill all the evildoers. Then towards the end, joy will be revealed and rest will appear, and then health will descend in dew, and illness will vanish, and fear and tribulation and lamentation will pass away from among people, and joy will encompass the earth. And nobody will again die untimely, nor will any adversity take place suddenly. Judgment, condemnations, contentions, revenges, blood, passions, zeal, hate, and all such things will go into condemnation, since they will be uprooted. I like those last sentences, and so this is one of the things that makes, they're odd. The imagery is odd. We kind of wonder, can we trust these writings? And then in these writings, we often see, again, scenes of tremendous violence, scenes of great anger, hopes for revenge, but also this is what the new world's going to look like, right? This is what God will hold on to. So I mentioned earlier, they really do carry in this uncomfortable tension, the crisis of the present moment, right? The depths of evil and oppression and hardship in the world, and this hope for a God who will bring something new, as does the Older Testament, of course. So as to see, this is some of the theological language that is in the air when Jesus is born. All right, so why should we care? Always the question to ask when I'm teaching. And it's this, right? The Old Testament only very rarely refers to these writings, not counting the book of Revelation. That's kind of it's in its own category in a lot of ways. But in general, the New Testament writings very rarely refer to these the ones I've just shown you on the recent slides. At the same time, the Newer Testament often expresses similar perspectives or assumptions about God and the world. In other words, this idea that God is going to break in, that God is going to send a deliverer, that God has got to do something about human suffering, that God has got to reinstitute a new world in which righteousness and justice reign and hold sway. And we see this in a variety of ways. In some ways, we see it with John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist, he doesn't get a lot of speaking lines in the Gospels, but here's one of them. Even now, the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. I baptize you with water for repentance, but the one who is coming after me is more powerful than I, and I am not worthy to carry his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and will gather his wheat into the granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. We'll have to ask the question, does the Jesus who comes match the Jesus that John might be expecting, or do we get something different with Jesus? But notice some of the expectation John is expressing here, right? The axe is at the root of the trees, right? We're on the verge, right? It's just about to happen. It's going to happen. There's this image of a stronger one coming after him. There's this image of a sorting between the wheat and the chaff, right? Somebody's going to have to fix this thing is part of what John's getting at here. And John's saying Jesus is going to do it. I'm not saying that John has read all the apocalypses and is saying, oh yeah, they're all about Jesus. I don't think we can draw a straight line from those apocalypses to John. But we see a similar kind of symbolism from time to time, a similar kind of hope that the problems of this world exceed humanity's ability to deal with them, and we need help. Right? And we're trusting on God to provide that help. Even Jesus himself occasionally says some things that make me wonder how much of this apocalyptic mindset might have been part of his own preaching and teaching. In Matthew 13, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and will separate the evil from the righteous and will throw them in the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Every now and then you read something great that Jesus says, and you turn the page and you're like, ouch. But again, this idea of a sorting, idea of a judgment, right? How are we going to separate? How are we going to keep the good safe from the bad? Well, we'll have to get rid of the bad, whatever that looks like. I'm not sure what Jesus says here lines up with kind of some of the traditional interpretations, but that's for a Newer Testament session on Jesus in Matthew in the fall. I'll just go quickly here. I have come to cast fire on the earth, and how I wish you were already ablaze. Not one of our Sunday school texts. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3 they will be divided, and so on. So Jesus at times will say things that kind of mirror some of these apocalyptic hopes, or some of these hopes and promises that we see in some of these apocalypses. The Apostle Paul, similar. I'm going to save this for later, so go home and read 1 Thessalonians 5. Sorry, I'm kind of rushing here to get all this in under the wire here. What does this mean then for thinking about, well, us? One thing to note is a reminder, right? Jesus and the church were not born into a theological vacuum. Right, they're born into a world where people are already frustrated about certain things, hoping for certain things, where people express their understanding of who God is in certain ways, where people express their understandings of what causes human misery in certain ways. And Jesus and Paul and other New Testament writers all speak into that, in some ways reshaping language or themes that people are already familiar with. There's a strong focus on God's agency or God's activity. In other words, a strong kind of unyielding belief that God is ever on the side of the world and committed to working on behalf of the world. Some of these apocalypses say that. I think you can find this all throughout the Newer Testament as well. Kind of this deep belief in God's trustworthiness, that God has not left the world to its own devices, but God is still present, active, caring. Also, a deep acknowledgement of suffering and struggle in a world that needs deliverance. It's one of the reasons I'm Presbyterian, I suppose, right? John Calvin had a very, very robust view of human sinfulness, right? That the world is fundamentally not a safe place for most of its residents. What does that mean? What's the root of the problem? The apocalyptic mindset is, yeah, because the world is utterly broken and there's all sorts of evil forces around us. I'm not so sure how far I take those in my own mind. I tend to remain undecided about a lot of those things, but Jesus certainly talks about that the problems with this world are more than just the bad choices individuals make, that we all need to be delivered from something. I think we see that in the Newer Testament as well. Promises of change, even change breaking in already. Jesus begins his ministry in Mark's gospel, says the time is fulfilled. Right? The kingdom of God has come near, right? This idea that things are changing. We are in the process of changing. The Apostle Paul has similar things to say, right? That we're breaking, this new creation is already breaking in. Christianity is a religion that I think situates us on the edge of something, right? On the edge of one world on its way out, a new world breaking in. This idea of a kingdom, of a rule of God that's just about to be unleashed, right? And it can try our patience from time to time as Christians, right? Because it's no fun to live on the edge, right? On the verge of something constantly, right? We're waiting to see it. And one of the reasons I think I come to gather on church on a Sunday morning is to look for signs of that kingdom, right? Breaking through, even when perhaps the events of a week might make me wonder if that's going to ever happen. It's not all positive. The other side, a little bit more negative. What happens to human accountability or to moral nuance if the world is divided into the righteous and the unrighteous, or saints and sinners, right? If everything is so easily separable, if what's going on in the world is the fault of some spiritual power and not myself, why am I to be blamed for anything? There's a way in which this apocalyptic mindset is somewhat morally naive, maybe, or maybe kind of, if all I have to do is wait for God to intervene, why should I do anything, right? There's a way we can fall into that. Some churches do. I don't think we do. Hope we don't. That's why I come to church on Sunday morning, so I don't. An intense focus on a coming end or a culmination raises the question of what kind of long-term future is worth hoping or planning for. If you really believe that God is just about to destroy this world and start a new one, then use all the gas you want. You know what I mean? It can be seen as kind of an irresponsible. Right? Anybody who's ever served on a council or a session of a church, what are we budgeting for? What's the future we imagine? Right? Should we just blow everything in the next 5 years because we think Jesus is coming back in 5 years, or do we imagine we have a legacy to future generations? I mean, that sounds like a silly question, but it's true, right? In what ways? What do we expect the future to look like? Some of the apocalyptic mindset makes you think I shouldn't worry about planning for the future, right? We should spend it all right now. I'm not sure that's the responsible way to live life as a follower of Jesus. So we just need to watch for that when we see it. And yes, longings for retribution. We occasionally see longings for God to settle the score, to destroy all of our enemies and move on. I feel that in my own heart from time to time, not with any of you in this room, but sometimes in the world I inhabit. And how do we tame those, right? I like to think Jesus promises a different way, a better way, so that we aren't eager for the kingdom of God to break in just so that my neighbor can get what's coming to them. I don't think that's how Jesus conducted himself. When it comes to stuff like that, it's pretty clear when he says things like, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You need a Bible scholar to help you get out of that one, and I can't. That's pretty plain right there. So yes, how do Paul also reshape some of these ideas as well? And how do the lessons that we've learned reshape our understanding of some of these things? That, my friends, is our apocalyptic writings. We'll come back to stuff like this, to some of these topics. We'll talk about angels and demons. We'll talk about what Jesus promises for the future in this next year in September when we talk about the Newer Testament. And again, just a reminder, right? Jesus' ways of talking, the gospel authors' ways of talking, Paul's ways of talking, their modes of expressions, their hopes and their concerns are influenced by a whole host of ideas that are in the air at the time in which they're alive. And so knowing some of that context, I hope, is important to make you a more faithful, more insightful Bible reader, so that these 4 weeks haven't just been, indulging my own interest in esoteric stuff from the ancient world. So yeah, we're going to be on a hiatus for the next 7 weeks or so in adult ed, but we will be back on Coming Together Sunday, which is September something, 8th? Some people know very well exactly. Yeah, September 8th, Coming Together Sunday. We have a few minutes if people have questions and comments. Sorry I didn't have more time for some discussion, but usually a topic like this raises things. And if people need to leave because it's 10:12 right now, feel free. I'm not at all offended. I'll hang out until questions are done.